And that's that. Good. Okay, so this is a lecture on the Constitution. And here's an overview of the Constitutional Convention. And we're going to talk about the fact that it's a balancing act between the democratic interests in the Constitutional Convention and the elite interests that wanted to keep power for themselves. We'll talk about what's in the Constitution and ratification, and I think that's all. What do you think was the most important piece of this whole thing? So, hi. So, what we have here is a constitutional convention being called in the wake of Shays' Rebellion and the problems with the articles. It was called by James Madison, and the leadership included Madison as the leading light of the Constitutional Convention. Other leaders there were Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington as the chair of the convention, and Benjamin Franklin as an elder statesman at the time. It was not a cross section of America. There was no small farmers included in the convention, and therefore it was the richest merchants and bankers and lawyers and plantation owners in the country. They met in secret and they made a vow to shuttle the windows and have them meet with the doors closed and the windows closed for a long time. So they met in secret in 1787 with the agreement that they would not publish any word of the debates, any notes from the convention until the last delegate was dead. That last delegate was James Madison, and his notes had him as the centerpiece of the convention. Kind of interesting. Okay, so they met in May in Philadelphia, and they met, and Madison proposed the Virginia Plan, which was a very radical departure from the Articles in the sense that it proposed a strong national government that was to be represented by based on population. If you had more people, you had more representatives. It was opposed by the New Jersey Plan, which kept the Articles in place and provided for a weak central government and proposed keeping one equal elector per state. So therefore they wanted to keep electoral equality. Well, the Great Compromise combined the two plans, and it took them a couple of months to wait for the compromise to come together, but eventually they combined the Virginia Plan in the House of Representatives and the New Jersey Plan in the Senate. And that was what the Great Compromise consisted of. So, to a great extent, what you have to see is the resulting constitution is a balancing act between elite and democratic interests. The elite interests are reflected in the legislature being with an elected Senate, which is the upper house, where they serve 6-year terms, where they're based not on population, but on the idea of state equality. So every state has 2 senators there, and they were appointed by the legislatures, not elected by the voters. So it has special powers too. Only the Senate approves presidential appointments. Only the Senate approves of treaties. The House doesn't have anything to say about those things. But generally, the legislature requires all bills be passed by both houses of Congress. The executive branch, the President of the United States, is elected by the Electoral College. All the Constitution says is that each state shall appoint electors to choose the president. If he doesn't receive a majority in the Electoral College, which, by the way, is one of the last things that was added to the Constitution, the Electoral College is kind of unknown at that time and even to the present. People don't understand who the electors are. But the number of electors equals the number of representatives and senators that every state has. When you don't have a majority in the Electoral College, the president is chosen by the House of Representatives, which is kind of interesting that it's only chosen by the House voting in state delegations. So 1 vote per state. The Supreme Court, the judicial branch, has lawyers that are appointed for life, and that is pretty far away from popular control. And it was meant to be. When you appoint a judge to these courts, they become honest men in the sense that they don't have to run for office. So the judicial branch are lawyers that are appointed for life terms to the federal bench. The democratic interests in the Constitution involve the House of Representatives, the lower chamber. They serve for 2 years. They're elected by voters that are not defined by the Constitution, but as expansive as the state wants to allow its voting bloc to be, it's based on population. And the more people you have in the state, the more electoral representatives you have. California has something like 55 members of the House, and Wyoming has 1. So the Constitution says that all money bills shall start in the in the House of Representatives, and that the House Ways and Means Committee shall forward all money bills to the Senate. Spending the people's money should be of great concern to the House. The Democratic interests are that the executive branch, the president, is elected by numbers of senators and representatives in the Electoral College, so that has a democratic element to it. And then the judicial branch is that the courts are independent, and this independence is very important to the federal judiciary. Okay. The Constitution has slavery in it, but it's not said. The word slavery is never used. There are euphemisms for slavery in the Constitution. Most famously, the Constitution counts each slave as 3/5 of a human being. That's crazy, but it reflects the fact that states counted them as 3/5 for this purpose. And so 3/5 was the number that was agreed to, that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. What this effectively did was gave the southern states with a lot of slaves a little more electoral power than they would have had otherwise. It also allowed the slave trade for the next 20 years. It said the Congress shall pass no law on the international slave trade until 1808. And in 20 years, Congress did, in fact, outlaw the international slave trade. Every state had made it illegal except for South Carolina and Georgia. And for the next 20 years, they're going to go on a slave buying frenzy and add about 500,000 slaves to the population of the United States. And then the third place where slavery is mentioned, and by the way, South Carolina and Georgia said you had to make mention of slavery or we're not going to join this union. And this is the price that was paid to get them to join the union. And the third element is a fugitive slave law, that Congress can pass a fugitive slave law on behalf of the slave owners of the states. Okay, and they also came up with the process to amend the Constitution. They said if you have 2/3 of Congress, each house, and 3/4 of the states to ratify the bill, you can amend the Constitution in the future. And that's what they did. So they've submitted the Constitution for ratification. And this took place in 87 and 88. They talked in the states about whether they wanted to be part of the union or not. And this map shows that if you take an election of the people right after the Constitutional Convention, it probably would have lost. It probably would not have been approved. But the Federalists who were in favor of the Constitution argued with the Anti-Federalists in state conventions where they talked about this. And they convinced enough people that the Constitution was a good ballast to defend your liberties in the Constitution. So gradually the Federalists began to win out against the Anti-Federalists and convince them to go along with the Constitution. One thing the Federalists did was they recognized they should have included a Bill of Rights, and they promised that as soon as the new government met in Philadelphia, they would add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and they did just that. To promote the Federalist position, there were newspaper editorialists called the Federalist Papers. These were published in New York City and published in the newspapers, and they were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And these three authors argued that the Federalist position was reasonable, and gradually this took hold and held sway over the rest. The 10th Federalist editorial was one that argued that liberties were best preserved in a large continental republic like the United States. It was way better to have a large federal republic than a small federal republic that would have special issues, interests coming to the fore and coming to dominate the government. So gradually, articles like Federalist Number 10 began to convince anti Federalists that the Federalist position was reasonable and therefore that helped the Constitution become ratified by the requisite number of states. Okay, that's the lecture on the Constitution. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.